Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone who are attending DigiLabor YouTube channel. My name is Rafael Groman. I am an assistant professor of media studies at University of Toronto. And today we are hosting Sahana Udupa and Gabriel Dattatreyan. Uh, and today we are hosting, one second, yeah. Uh, and Sahana Dupa and Gabriel will talk about their new brand book, Digital Unsettling. Sahana is professor of media anthropology at University of Munich, and Gabriel is assistant professor of anthropology at New York University. And this book, Digital Unsettling, is a critical exploration of digitalization that puts contemporary decolonizing movements into conversation with theorization of digital economy, digital communication, and the book establishes a critical framework for placing digitalization within the long dure of coloniality, while also revealing the complex ways in which the internet is intertwined with persistent global calls for decolonization. Thank you, Sahana and Gabriel, to having us, and feel free to start about your brand new book. We are very curious about that.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for having us. Gabriel also says the same, I'm sure. So on behalf of myself and Gabriel, thank you so much for having us. So this is how we are going to present this book today. I'm going to speak for 5 minutes about the overall argument of the book. Then I'll hand it over to Gabriel to talk about the methods and different unique interventions. And later on, we are going to talk about different chapters in the book. And there again, we split the chapters between us. So digital unsettling, decoloniality, and dispossession in the age of social media. I'm just also trying to present this. Okay. So this new book published by New York University Press explores different dimensions of digital communication and how they are connected to contemporary social crises and movements. And we do this by arguing that the digital is shaped by longer histories of coloniality. And by advancing this argument, we complicate and challenge presentist, liberal, and technocentric readings of the digital. We show how social media is a primary arena where colonial conditions of the present are now being contested, debated, and also reinforced. Over the course of 6 chapters in this book, we examine structures and processes that have reinforced neocolonial relations within today's digital environments. Our special focus here is on online extreme speech and data colonialism. We stage a number of examples: right-wing attacks against academics and progressive voices, the explosion of racist, anti-immigrant, and misogynistic language on social media, the ambitions of Silicon Valley capitalists to capture all these, in fact, capture everyone as data. Assessing the digital in relation to the violence of coloniality, we also interrogate how the internet is entwined with persistent calls for decolonization. And we hear this across the world today. And these movements are expanding globally as they are linked to material struggles on the ground. Here again, we stage a number of examples: decolonization movements that have shaken the university campuses from South Africa to the US and the UK, to struggles around epistemic parity and citational justice. So we assess this tension, and in doing so, we take a distinctly critical ethnographic perspective. We root ourselves in the discipline of anthropology, but we also draw on a wide range of intellectual sources, especially critical digital studies and media and communication studies. And we also engage with different other traditions within critical cultural studies. So earlier this week, when Gabriel and I were chatting, we realized that this book had been within our minds and bodies for a very long time. It had to come out. Let me recount one incident that was quite revealing from my side of experience. It was early 2020, a month before the COVID 19 pandemic brought physical gatherings to a complete standstill. It was an elite social club in Munich. I was chatting with a journalist who was at that time writing a book on the fashion industry in Germany. And she said, with a sense of urgency, that digital revolution is destroying French Revolution. So, in stating this crisis so piquantly, she was actually voicing an anxiety that has gripped liberally leaning elites in the last 2 decades of digital decadence. So, there is clearly something very bad about the digital, according to these elites. And many of us agree as well. There is a massive expansion of disinformation, misinformation, and vitriol. But for this journalist, values of liberty, freedom, and emancipation established after much hardship and struggle during the European Enlightenment are now being decimated by the hate and lies of digital media, favoring the far right. I kept my voice low, and I was not intending to agitate this well meaning journalist. And I kind of murmured that the past that she nostalgically invoked as an embodiment of liberal freedom had flourished at a time when the same ruling powers unleashed numbing violence in the colonies by rationalizing the suspension of liberal values in places beyond the metropole as a necessary phase in the civilizing mission of modernity. I could see that there was a mild frown on her face. The reference to violent colonial histories that implicates the liberal regimes of the global north appeared to unsettle her diagnosis of the present as an abrupt aberration, that the digital revolution is decimating the gains of the French Revolution. And this moral panic, according to us, belies a deeper problem that is both epistemological and political. By positioning online vitriol, especially, as an antithesis of liberal communication and as a contemporary crisis that's somehow instigated by digital channels, this kind of analysis and moral panic glosses over grave historical continuities. And that is something that we wanted to highlight. The perception of danger in the digital age in such accounts develops from and reinforces a liberal self-understanding of calm rationality. So there was then the need to highlight the limits of this self-understanding and complicate the framing that all things that are wrong today are because of today's digital communication. We had to complicate this presentist argument, showing at the same time that digital networks are shaped by and reinforce longer histories of racialization and dispossession. And this decolonial reading cannot be limited to understanding extreme expressions, because this has been my research topic for some time now. But very soon we realized that it is not just about extreme speech. The very dimensions of digital communication had to be appraised using this critical perspective. And when I proposed this idea of writing a book together, Gabriel instantly nodded, because he had approached this problem from the perspective of his involvement on campus struggles and contestations over knowledge. So, how do we bring these different strands together? And how do we bring our distinct experiences and disciplinary trainings together? As we started working on this, what emerged was what we call the methodology of montage. On that, I will leave the ground to Gabriel to say more about how we wrote this book and what were the challenges and what were the good things about this.
Thanks so much, Sahana. And thanks, Raphael, again for hosting us and inviting us to talk about our new book. So I'll just say a few words about our method, right? So starting with this really great kind of introduction, right, that Sahana gave us, and jumping into this idea of montage, but then also talking a little bit about method when it comes to writing, right? So One of the questions that I've been posed in the last few weeks that the book has been out, and I was mentioning, we were talking about this the other day on our call, prepping for this event, was how to write a co-authored monograph, right? And so I'm going to just say a few words about how we tackle that and some of the I think really important learnings that come out of writing together and doing a shared kind of engagement with these really important and yet challenging topics, and then some of the challenges that emerge out of that, right? Okay, so I'll start with ethnography, because I think that that Sahana's vignette, the vignette that she just shared, is a really good segue, right, to thinking about ethnography and ethnographic methods more broadly for studying digital unfoldings. So both of us are trained in anthropology and have been trained in slightly different ways around how to approach media anthropology. And so it was a really fruitful kind of coming together to think about the different ways we were trained, but then what we shared. And so I'll start with what we shared. So what we really shared as a kind of methodological ethic, right, was this idea that we could approach social media and digital media happenings holistically, right? That an ethnographic approach allowed us to include the digital quad digital, so things that were happening in social media sites, but that it didn't preclude us including and engaging with moments on the ground, like the moment that Sahana just described, right, as critical to understanding what was actually happening in online spaces, right? So this kind of ethnographic holism, I think, is something that we both really understood and shared, and was a huge driver in how we approach developing the language for describing the kind of project that we were attempting in this book, right? And so montage became a vehicle, a way of articulating our ethnographic approach that recognized that in order to be able to theorize the longue durée of coloniality in the digital, we needed to bring together various scenes at different scales, right, to be able to think about it. So I'm just going to read a quick passage on how we were thinking about montage very specifically, and how that relates to another key idea in anthropology having to do with method, right? So what does ethnography do? It allows us to produce comparisons, right? So I'm just going to read from page 15. In colonial anthropology, comparison is used as a means to position the West in relation to the rest, sometimes explicitly, often implicitly, to develop culturalist insights about specific locations. This West and rest paradigm has also informed comparative approaches in other disciplines, such as communication studies and development studies. Our reimagining of comparison as digital method primarily draws together mediatized examples from the US, the UK, Germany, and India, locations where the two of us have affective, social, economic, and political connection, and places where we have ongoing field work, and then puts them in productive relation with each other. Our decision to think and theorize from these particular locations emerges out of a commitment shaped by feminist thought to center our partial and situated knowledges as they emerge in and between these locations. So just moving a little bit ahead, the digital invites and amplifies this sort of recalibration of comparison as a shifting, moving, and deeply affective strategy of knowing that is constrained and enabled by various power relations and affinities by placing in the various network platforms we traverse the semiotics, repertoires, political economies, and histories of multiple locations into iterative dialogue and unstable encounter. Comparison in this sense is no longer the privilege of the researcher, but is a ubiquitous feature of the digital condition that fosters a collective articulation and debate linked to multiple points of felt, relation, and connection. We might describe this ethnographic method shaped by the digital condition as montage, that works by placing events and spaces similar to a timeline on a social media site into radical juxtaposition in ways that hold the potential to reveal the enduring structures that connect contexts. So montage for us was a way to kind of bring together both our respective fieldwork projects, right, which have spanned almost a decade now in each of our accounts or more, and put them into conversation with each other within this broader and yet narrower set of relations, right, that social media and mediatized circulations enables. So a few words about writing. So, writing a shared monograph requires some level of reflexive thought, and that reflexive thought needs to, I think, begin early on in the process, but then also needs to continuously be revisited, right? So voicing and trying to think through how we voice together and apart, to think through, what our individual stakes were in this project and then our shared stakes were in this project. These were all really important conversations for us to have and then to demonstrate and make explicit in the text. And so what we've tried to do throughout the book is really mark and index the moments where our voices shift, right? When it's Sahana speaking or when it's me that's speaking, right? Or when we're having a shared moment, recognizing that the text in its entirety is a dialogic framework in and of itself, right? And so what this does for our critical engagement is it opens up the potential for ways to see things that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to see or notice, or we didn't think necessarily needed to be explicated in ways that we found very productive, right, as we were moving through the text. And I'm actually very, I can say this in this venue, in this setting, I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish through this process, right, of learning from each other, of exchanging critical notes back and forth. And I want to just thank Sahana for being such an amazing epistemic partner, right, in this project.
Thank you, Gabriel. I think I should return the same compliment because we both have really read each other's mind even as we were writing our script. So that's something which was really very fascinating about writing as an experiment. And what was also, I think, very common between us was shared concerns around the topics that we highlight in this book. For both of us, decoloniality as a conceptual framework, as ethical praxis, and later on also as a methodology, were somehow deeply embedded in our ongoing works. And also there was a sort of tacit division of labor, I must say, because I was leaning towards the darker side and Gabriel was leaning towards the hopeful side. And we really brought all these energies together to explicate the tension around the digital. So we will just introduce very briefly some of the chapters in this book. The first chapter is Campus, and Gabriel will be introducing that chapter to us. And after Campus, we have the chapters Extreme and Capture. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them. So in the Extreme chapter, we take up invective language, harassment, and trolling episodes for a closer critical inquiry. We all know that there is very huge and growing scholarship on this topic. There are very many studies on disinformation, vitriol, and downright comical nuisance that has suffused social media conversations from top leaders to ordinary users. Social media has facilitated the conditions for vitriolic attacks against racialized groups, immigrants, LGBTQ plus communities, women, indigenous communities, ethnic groups, and religious minorities in different contexts. And these self-fashioned upholders of online freedom of expression have regularly showered uh, a whole bunch of sobriquets, insults, aphorisms, and I could go on and on with the list. Libtards are liberal retards, secular as opposed to secular, race baiters, regressive left, the politically correct, prostitute, social justice warriors. And in Germany, there's a word called Gutmensch, which means overly politically correct persons. It's a derogatory term. So this vitriolic culture has recharged public concerns over hate speech and has also paradoxically cemented lulz-fed colloquialism as a form native to internet communication. How do we make sense of this? Of course, as I mentioned, there's a vast volume of scholarship here, but our key departure is from frameworks that see online vitriol as a contemporary crisis in the liberal social order, or just the result of villainous populists. This kind of analysis recenters the rational West as the locus and subject of crisis. We have instead argued with our framework of extreme speech that close contextualization of proximate worlds of online practice, by which we mean social media affordances, habits, norms, networks, incentives, and so on, should always be combined with deep contextualization of longer histories of racialization and dispossession. And this kind of decolonial reading opens up critical pathways to inquire into the nature of online vitriol, who is targeted and how are they targeted, and also ways of knowing what is damaged through speech. And these different moves, analytical moves and empirical cases, we present in Extreme chapter. In here, we conceptualize coloniality as a global unfolding of three interrelated relations: nation-state relations, racial relations, and market relations. This decolonial reading means that vitriolic exchange that we see on social media is not a level playing field of profanities that are distributed equally among different ideological groups. So sometimes there's the assumption that everybody is getting very rude with each other, and one has to also equally hurl similar things to political opponents and so on. But we see this as a volatile arena where deeper colonial histories press on the present, allowing contemporary digital communicative forms to affect vulnerable groups in very specific ways. So, in other words, online extreme speech cannot be explained simply as an expression of transhistorical prejudices and hatreds, but it's a specific conjuncture of digital affordances and affects that have allowed colonial histories of racialization and religious majoritarianism and ethnic divisions to impinge on and violently shape the present. So in the Extreme chapter, we give several examples for this. We also navigate this field ethnographically based on fieldwork in Germany and India with right-wing actors. And we also analyze a trolling episode against an academic based in the UK. In the next chapter, which is titled Capture, we take up market relations institutionalized by coloniality as our primary focus. There is enough evidence today that polarized discourses are also commercially exploited by companies. Capture chapter delves deeper into the political economy of global data regimes beyond the effects around extreme speech they've helped coalesce. So in the previous chapter, we connect that with a specific problem of online extreme speech here. We widen that political economy analysis and try to understand how these relations are connected to longer processes of coloniality. And in doing this, we join the conversation on data colonialism and develop some distinct angles. Our first critique here sheds light on a curious but disturbing continuity. Global data relations that aim to extract and monetize behavioral surplus, as they call it, share affinities with problematic anthropological colonial tropes about how to capture natives in their natural environments. So, what Silicon Valley priests aspire for and pontificate about data today are strikingly similar to how colonial anthropologists talked about tracking and gaining knowledge about the so called natives. And therefore, we show that contemporary data capture to track, plot, and manipulate behavioral and interactional traces as data is not entirely new. It has a historical precedent and it has problematic parallels to how anthropology emerged as the science of the colonizer. In the next sections, we take this decolonial critique into two different contemporary conditions. One is algorithmic racism, and second, vast global unevenness in social media content moderation. So I'll just very briefly talk about the second part. If we take content moderation as a case study, we see that there are deep disparities in the allocation of corporate resources and attention that these companies give to different regions of the world in terms of how they protect people from the consequences of online extreme speech. For instance, AI assisted content moderation is not equipped to handle problematic content in many different languages of the world. And this has affected people speaking minoritized languages most severely. Even more, content moderation as a kind of scavenging work has reproduced what Sarita Amrute calls racialized hierarchy of digital labor. And I think for this group on digi labor, this becomes a very important point because we're also trying to show how digital labor is racialized and it depends on a longer history of racialized hierarchy. And the global hierarchy of digital labor, this content moderation work as a sort of scavenging work is shipped to third-party contractors in the global south, sometimes also to evade direct regulatory impacts and implications, or sometimes it's also shipped to peripheralized corners of the metropole, usually to immigrants within Western metropoles. So these are some of the empirical materials that we are tackling in the chapter capture. But broadly, in both these chapters, we provide a decolonial reading of some of the dark dimensions of digital communication. I will now request Gabriel to talk about campus and knowledge citation.
Hi, yeah. So if Sahana, if as she just covered the more the darker side of our inquiry, I'll maybe offer a little bit on the more hopeful. Although there's some complications, right, with the way that we kind of are thinking about the hopeful in digital spaces of interaction. So the first chapter I want to highlight is our chapter on campus, where we're really thinking about the university and the campus. The campus of the university is a site for colonial disruption, and so we're taking up the campus both as a mediatized and mediated space, and then as a physical space where movements, and particularly student movements, have called into question the ongoing colonial nature of higher education. And so we start with a discussion and an engagement with South Africa and with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, to then start thinking about other campus locations in Europe, in the UK, in the US, with a very brief mention of campus social movements in Latin America, to begin to think about the connections and continuities that social media produces across these geographies, and the way that colonial histories are evoked as a way of contesting the kind of status quo, right? So I'm just going to read again a passage that gets to precisely what we were trying to do in this chapter, and then say a few more words about it. Okay, on page 30, what we are interested in engaging with in this chapter are the ways in which hashtags, images, and particular repertoires of digital performance create the conditions for students across national contexts to link institutional racisms and structural epistemic colonialities endemic to universities, even if unevenly and in tension with issues of enduring economic inequality. This development signals a rebirth of an international political project that does not pit identity against a critique of capital, but polyvocally narrates each as awkwardly intertwined between and within the campus networks that the digital facilitates. As such, it places the university campus at the center of struggles for the future and campus protests as incubators for imagining a way forward. It is precisely because of the symbolic and material coloniality of the university campus and its potential as a mediated space to imagine and otherwise that we begin this book and our theorization of digital unsettling here. So the campus, right, is a kind of primary space for us to think with, not in small part because we are both academics who are situated and spend the majority of our lives and time with students on physical campuses in Germany and the United States. So for us, the university is a location from which to understand the affective and temporal politics of decolonization and its potential to rupture enduring colonial arrangements as it manifests in online spaces in ways that shape, connect, and amplify transnational protest. And so throughout the chapter, right, we're working through this kind of online-offline relationship and the ways that rupture happens across national contexts. And much of the kind of ethnographic is situated in a social movement space that I had the privilege to participate in while I was at Goldsmiths University of London, where students occupied primary administrative buildings for almost 3 months as part of a broader protest against conditions of inequality and against racial harm. So where the campus chapter, I think, extends, right, into some of what Sahana just talked about with regards to capture and then also to extreme speech, right, is the space where the university administrators attempt to redress harm by offering up speech acts, right, that recognize enduring colonial relations, that attempt to decolonize curricula, for instance, or that attempt to use the language of reparation in order to mitigate harm. And so we spend a little bit of the end of the campus chapter thinking about what all of these efforts mean and how they're situated within these larger, longer dure struggles, right, for justice in various nation-state contexts. In the knowledge and citation chapter, we focus on the ways that the digital opens up space for knowledge projects that exceed, right, the kind of institutional knowledge projects of the university systems in and across nation-state contexts. And so I'm going to again read a short passage or two from knowledge citation to give you a sense of how we have approached this. In the last decade, there's been an influx of online knowledge production by Black, queer, Indigenous, and otherwise marginalized scholars who've trained in US, continental European, and British academies. Blogs, podcasts, YouTube videos, Instagram accounts, websites, and Twitter threads have become vehicles for these scholars who experience being made peripheral by the colonial university to articulate critiques and offer theoretically rich and empirically grounded takes on current and historical events. This compendium of digital content creates what Memembe, in his Abiola lecture on future knowledges, describes as extra institutional knowledge that is unbounded, uncontainable, and easily searchable. For many of these scholars, online sites of production and dissemination enable a political engagement and an interface with broader publics and specific networks in ways that sidestep the willfully naive geopolitical orientation of the formal academy that continues to rank people in regions and racially configured geographies. Moreover, the internet enables scholars to push against and altogether refuse formal disciplinary conventions regarding form, subject, method, and theory. Digital platforms with all of their multimodal and affectively charged potentialities enable scholars to articulate theoretically rich insights that do not necessarily resort to what Barbara Christian describes as Western forms of abstract logic. And so these kind of subterranean academic endeavors, right? So what academics are doing in online spaces were of deep importance to us, but we were also thinking about those who are not in the academy and the ways in which they're producing knowledge online. So I'll just read another paragraph or passage on page 128. So these academically located counter-hegemonic knowledge projects that are produced by those on the margins of academia or within, but not fully within, without, are joined by the projects of those who do not have formal affiliations or even informal connections with institutions. Here examples abound, but to briefly illustrate, we point to the efflorescence of indigenous media production and their digital circulations in the last decade. We think about various instances of minoritized groups producing media for circulation online. One example of that would be Dalit Media. We talk a little bit about Dalit Media, which is a group of non-academic Dalit media makers who are making critical caste interventions in India. So essentially, this chapter is to get us to think about the stakes, right, of knowledge production online and how that unsettles knowledge arrangements, right, that start or that commence in the colonial period as a kind of stable structure for understanding and knowing, and which has continued into the present, and think about the ways in which that forces us to contend with what we as academics, as knowledge producers inside institutions, need to think about, need to do, need to connect with, what kinds of networks we need to be in dialogue with. Towards the end of the chapter, we also kind of think a little bit about how right-wing manifestations of decolonial knowledge products have begun to appear online, and I say begun in the broadest of senses, right? So in the last almost decade, but are becoming increasingly present. How right-wing groups are using the very same space to claim decolonial decolonial sensibility, maybe might be the best way to say it, around their projects in various nation state contexts. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. We also have another chapter, Home Field. And in this chapter, I think we take a reflexive position. Of course, the whole book is reflexive in a very prominent sense. But in this chapter, I think we reflect on our navigations in the Western Academy and our field sites, and talk about the predicament of home and field. And we talk about how the digital haunts us everywhere. We can't escape that. And we talk about the vulnerabilities of academics when we begin to research dark topics. And we talk about networked exposure and how networked exposure has made research difficult in some sense. So if I have to just quickly read one paragraph from page 159, we explore how networked exposure is conducive to research in terms of enhancing reciprocity and mutual exchange between researchers and research participants, or develops into a virulent form when connectivity becomes a vexing issue for researchers, particularly transnational and diasporic ones who are engaged in exploring grim practices such as online cultures of contemporary right-wing movements at home. We push for a reading of an ethical research praxis that does not necessarily bifurcate these effects, but rather sees them as part and parcel of the consequences and potential opportunities that the digital produces as it remixes the home field distinction along multiple vectors. So I will not get into the detail of this chapter. We will leave the rest for those of you who wish to read the book, but we'll be happy to take any questions.
That I'm not in the screen now. Yes. Sorry for that. Is great. And in that, in all this stuff regarding, on the one hand, more global south, and we three are from global south and based on global north institutions and all these things. And on the other hand, how institutions can co-opt this decolonizing as a brand for them. And I'd like to know from you how you saw all these struggles for meanings regarding, on the one hand, pushing more about decolonizing with more liberatory struggles, and this trying to co-opt, including our concepts.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think we also reflect on this predicament, our experiences of navigating the Western academy. And you're so right that we come from the global South, employed in the universities in the global North. Our journeys in the West as immigrants have actually helped our analysis, and we've reflected about our own positionalities as upper caste, middle class subjects, and we fall within the privileged bracket of desirable migrants in the West. And some of these feelings have actually uh, um, shaped our encounters with different kinds of people in the West. I talked about my encounter with the journalist in Munich, but in, on university campuses and outside of the university spaces, we have interacted with different colleagues, and in these encounters, we've often felt that we are interpellated into liberal framings of crisis. And this is a phrase that we get from the book. Um, I'm going to talk a little more about it, and I'm quoting it. We are included by the very speech act into a reproduction of a glorious European legacy, or a geographical division of here and there, them and us. And these are difficult and awkward encounters, in fact. So we are constantly reminded of our possible complicities in their reproductions, but we've tried to respond to that with critique, and we've also responded to that by developing methods that sort of rupture the epistemology of calm distance. And for us, decoloniality is not just a fashionable term for career gains. It is something that is deeply connected to our experiences of navigating and understanding these topics. This is something that we take up in detail in the home field chapter that we did not talk about in detail in our presentations. But when it comes to extreme speech, in fact, far from calm distance, we were actually quite alarmed whenever we wore this researcher's hat, sometimes knowingly, but also sometimes out of compulsive habit. And when they scroll the internet, there is just such swelling number of racist and anti-immigrant comments online. So we also, of course, have witnessed horror, several incidents of physical violence, from mob lynching of minority Muslims in India to the burning of refugee homes in Germany. And how these wounding words and dehumanizing language circulating on online social media translate into violent events on the ground. And therefore, in these moments of our own journeys in the university space, falling within the bracket of desirable migrants, but also having to witness this and experience some of these racialized comments and attacks, it actually gave us a sort of unique framework and positionality to investigate the digital in a different way. And these are embodied experiences. And these embodied experiences are intertwined with political feeling, to quote Neetu Khanna. And it forms a sort of visceral ground for decolonial thinking. And therefore, decoloniality for us is an evocative political space where the analytical edge of research comes fused with the viscerality of our embodied experience. Again, I'm quoting from the book, pushing us to think through the digital with keen attention to colonial histories, geographies, effects, and lived meanings. I will leave it at that. Gabriel, I'm sure, will have more to add.
Yeah, maybe just just a couple of very small things. So I think location and movements across location matter quite a bit. Actually, matter a great deal when we're thinking about historical processes, right, of decolonization. So what might be a conversation about decolonization in in one context, say India, right, might be a very different conversation in the United States, right? When we're thinking about indigenous movements, we're thinking about land back struggles, right? And so one of the things, as we attempted to do this quite ambitious project of moving across locations, was to really think about and pay very close attention to the different stakes involved as the discourse of decolonization moved across contexts, right? So what would we need to attune ourselves to, pay attention to very carefully, as we both analyzed the ways in which decolonization was being mobilized by marginalized groups in various nation-state contexts, as well as be very attentive to when institutional spaces, when universities in particular, but other university spaces, other spaces outside of the university co-opt, right, the discourse of decolonization towards very very particular ends. Yeah. And so that project of thinking across spaces, I think, going back to method, to thinking with montage, right? So putting different locations into radical juxtaposition was uncomfortable in many ways. Uncomfortable because, when you're reckoning with colonial histories, coloniality in the present, and as it's unfolded over time, plays out very differently in different contexts. So, how do you actually write in these kind of nuances and really think with these nuances when you're thinking across, right, locations? So, if we're thinking about anti-immigrant sentiment in Germany, at the same time as we're thinking about the rise of kind of Islamophobic, a very particular kind of Islamophobic sentiment in India, right? That has a different history than, say, Islamophobia in Germany. Like, how do we talk about those things? How do we think about those things? How do we approach it? And I think having these conversations in the background as we've been trying to kind of move through what we've been writing has been really helpful. And has been at the center of the project, right? There was a moment, I think, for me, but I think for both of us, where we were trying to think about what the purchase of decoloniality was in this particular moment, and what were the stakes in us taking it up, right? I just had a friend, tell me that they're in a conference in Germany at the moment, right now as we speak, right? And decoloniality is being thrown about willy-nilly. And what she said was really important, I think, for this conversation. She said decoloniality at the moment, and the way that it's being mobilized in the European Academy, is such that it's being used to efface conversations about racism, to elide conversations about very particular, very materialized acts of discrimination that rely on colonial racial logics, right? And that, to me, is, it really marks the stakes quite powerfully.
Great. This is very nuanced approach, and yeah, looking forward to read the book. We have a question from the audience. I don't know if you are able to respond. From Lucio Mello. Lucio asks, how do you see this pasteurized notion of digital victorization of space have been producing, and how to deal with this homotopy going beyond utopia and dystopia, but homotopy versus heterotopy? I don't know how to respond. The floor is yours.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of terminology there that we would need to understand a little bit more in order for us, I think, and Sahana, please weigh in. So I'm not sure what all of these terms are doing in the question for Lucio. I can try to translate it and understand it as best as I can, right? So, so I think what Lucio is trying to get at is moving away from some sort of binary, right? Binary between a kind of utopic potential, right? That the digital kind of valorizes, right? In its unfolding, right? So that there'll be some sort of techno future, right? A utopic techno future, versus the kind of pessimism, right? That the digital has ushered in, a kind of fear, right? That the digital is just gonna, it's all bad, right? and moving to homotopy and heterotopy, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's a maybe more nuanced sensibility, right? Like how do we read things in a more nuanced way so that it's neither, all utopia or all dystopia or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think our book is precisely trying to do that, right? It's trying to put into conversation a kind of more hopeful and a darker kind of reading of the digital in order to try to first of all locate them in a broader or longer history, right, of colonialism. Like colonialism was very much a utopic project, no? It was about producing for European settlers a utopic future, right? As much as it was a complete dystopia for those who were colonized. So I think bringing the longue durée of coloniality into play actually allows us to produce something that's more nuanced. So think about something that's more nuanced, right? To think about what the digital does in a more nuanced way. Sahana?
I think you've covered it, Gabriel. I also understand this question as a concern about binary analysis, the dystopic and also utopian views of digital communication. And this bifurcation runs through scholarship on digital communication because there's a vast body of scholarship that evinces very directly a sense of techno-optimism that these channels have brought about a very real possibility for horizontal peer-to-peer communication beyond the controls of legacy gatekeepers. And that led to the initial euphoria around digital communication and internet communication as the harbinger of emancipatory globalism. On the other hand, studies, especially in the last few years, at least a decade now, studies have been increasingly documenting the dark side of digital communication, how it has led to different forms of challenges and even damages to the democratic order. So these two streams of scholarship are important, but the binary vision is probably not very helpful. And that's precisely what we are trying to complicate in our work. We are trying to open up different spaces where the digital has indeed become a site of hoping and imagining a better future and forging solidarities and questioning entrenched hierarchies in a very unconventional sense. But at the same time, they are embedded within longer structures of dispossession, whether it is data capitalism or forms of extreme speech that we investigate. So throughout, we hope that this book provides that nuanced account of the digital and the contradictory impulses that drive the digital. And one last point is also about our departure from a liberal reading of this. Our key objective in this book is to move away from liberal understandings as though this problem is a fight between equal parties, drawing false equivalence between different kinds of episodes and actors. So we really are keen to take this binary thinking aside, but also liberal reading aside. Hopefully, the book serves this objective.
Gabriel, do you want to add something?
I think we've covered that question. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. My final question for you, I have many more, but now for Sahana is like 7 p.m. now. I have one question about the digital colonialism, or how do you approach in relation to the recent scholarship on all the stuff regarding data colonialism or AI, decolonial AI, or whatever combinations we can do with colonialism or coloniality and digital and media and AI and data and so on and algorithms. I felt that one of your approach is this longue durée, in this kind of complexity about the nuances around how digital media or digital communication change, but regarding this long durée coloniality. But I would like to know from you, how do you positionate within this recent scholarship on colonialism and digital?
Yeah, very quickly, because we are also running out of time. So we understand that there is also a very vast uptake for the very term coloniality and decolonizing different things, as you mentioned. Data colonialism is also something that scholars are embracing from many different disciplinary traditions. And this is quite encouraging because there is a very keen attention on inequalities, a very keen attention on how some of these processes are deeply exploitative. But at the same time, as we've been saying here, I think there's the real danger of co-optation. There's the real danger of effacing the very project that we have envisioned around the term decoloniality, around a decolonial sensibility, as we call it in this book. And those dangers we have to be constantly be mindful of. And I think here we do not want to equate data colonialism, for instance, with actual physical violence and grave realities of historical colonialism. And that is something that bothers us as well. Are we also trying to use this in a very loose way, for instance? But time and again, we reminded ourselves throughout the book, we try to develop this and engage with decoloniality as a conceptual framework, but also, more importantly, as an ethical praxis where collaboration becomes central to how we do research and how we also engage with our research partners. And therefore, for us, decoloniality and decolonizing the digital are, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, it's a conceptual framework because it brings out the three relations of coloniality and how they press on the present, but it's also an ethical praxis. And now we've also talked about methodology, how it can also help us navigate these distinctive but connected spaces reflexively. I leave it to Gabriel.
Yeah, that was a pretty comprehensive thing. Maybe I have one thing to add. So I think an approach to data colonialism that narrows the engagement to data relations maybe misses the coloniality of and the colonial order of things in the present, but also historically. And so, one of the ways as anthropologists we've approached it, just to go back to my first comments around holism, right, is to recognize and grapple with the kind of material conditions, right, that enable particular forms of data relations from the start, right? So, attending to labor relations, at least opening up the space to think about labor relations, right? Attending to land relations, attending to various framings of materiality and material relations, I think is absolutely critical moving forward. I just saw there's a project now that's coming out, and so again, just to echo Sahana, that there's a kind of there's a good movement that's happening, right, where people are really trying to think about extraction, for example, in relation to data, but also to mining, right, as well as the kind of labor relations they both produce, right? There's a project I just saw that's coming out of Leuven in Belgium that's trying to do this kind of work. I think that's really the way forward, because if we narrow things down to just data, we miss so much.
Great. This is really a great conversation, and looking forward to read your book and also continue to engage in this conversation. I wish you have like a big tour on regarding this book, and count on me with that too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafael.
Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, everyone who are watching this. Thank you, Lucio, for your question, and have a good weekend, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye.